This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media. In 2022, something pretty major happened in Nepal. It wasn't just another election, it was more like a political earthquake. And the force behind it? A massive, digitally savvy, and deeply frustrated youth population. This is the story of how a generation is trying to remake a nation and the powerful, entrenched system that's pushing back. So let's start with that upheaval in 2022. This wasn't just about small shifts in policy. No, this was a generation channeling years of frustration and channeling it directly into the ballot box. And their rallying cry was simple but incredibly powerful. No, not again. It was a message aimed squarely at the old guard, the aging political class that's been running Nepal for decades. This campaign, mostly organized online, got young voters energized, and the results were stunning. You had independents like Balen Shah winning the mayorship of Kathmandu, and a brand new party, the Rashtriya Swatantra Party, or RSP, just bursting onto the scene. Now, to really understand what's driving all this, you have to look at the numbers. And in Nepal, the demographic data tells a really fascinating story. Just think about this for a second. Over 40% of Nepal's entire population is between 16 and 40 years old. This is what's known as a youth bulge. And historically, whenever you see a demographic wave like this, it often comes with major social and political change. But here's the flip side of that coin, and it's a tough one. The economic reality for these young people is bleak. Youth unemployment is sitting at a staggering 19.2%. Now compare that to the national average, which is under 3%. That single statistic right there is a direct measure of blocked ambition, and it's a huge driver of their frustration. And this is where all that economic frustration boils over into politics. Even though they make up over 40% of the population and more than half of all voters, young people hold only 5% of the seats in parliament. That is a massive democratic deficit, way below the global average. So when you put all these numbers together in one place, the picture becomes crystal clear. You've got a demographic majority that is, at the same time, an economic and political minority. This is the fundamental contradiction that's fueling this entire youth movement. They have the numbers, but they don't have the jobs or the political power. You know, this is exactly why people say that Nepal's youth bulge is a double-edged sword. On one hand, all that energy and talent could be an incredible engine for growth and innovation. But on the other hand, if all that energy just hits a brick wall of no opportunity, it can become a really powerful force for instability. So, we've seen the frustration. Now let's talk about how this generation got organized. And spoiler alert, they didn't follow the old political playbook. They completely bypassed the traditional party structure and took to social media instead. This timeline really shows you the evolution. In the past, young activists were basically just foot soldiers for the established political parties. But then in 2020, you saw these digitally native movements like #EnoughIsEnough pop up, and that really paved the way for the direct political action we saw with the No Not Again campaign in 2022. Let's take a closer look at that #EnoughIsEnough movement, because it was a real turning point. It started in a Facebook group that just exploded to 200,000 members, all protesting the government's handling of the pandemic. They used peaceful, creative tactics, and even though they faced water cannons and arrests, they didn't back down. And it worked. They actually forced the government to change its policies, proving that this new digital model of activism could get real results. Okay, so they've had some big wins. But here's the thing. Winning a protest, or even an election, is one thing. Changing an entire system is a whole different ballgame. And this youth movement is now running up against some deeply entrenched barriers and some really difficult paradoxes. So what we're looking at is a fundamental power struggle. On one side, you have the youth, with their massive numbers and their power on social media. But on the other side, you have a system that feels designed to keep them out. We're talking restrictive age limits for holding office, the crazy high cost of running in an election, and vast patronage networks all controlled by a political old guard. And this brings us to a really tricky, almost tragic paradox. It's called the remittances paradox. See, the lack of jobs at home forces millions of young Nepalis to go abroad for work. This brain drain is basically a vote of no confidence in the system. But here's the twist. The money they send back home, the remittances, makes up about a quarter of the entire country's GDP. It artificially props up the economy, and that reduces the pressure on the old guard to make any real fundamental reforms. So let's just walk through how this vicious cycle actually works, step by step. It starts with a lack of opportunity. That leads to mass migration. That migration then generates these huge flows of money back into the country. That money stabilizes the economy. And that economic cushion, well, it allows the political establishment to avoid making the very reforms that might have created jobs in the first place. In a strange way, the youth protesting the system are also unintentionally subsidizing its survival. So what happens next? What happens when these disruptive new political players actually win an election and get a seat at the table? Well, the aftermath of 2022 shows that winning at the ballot box is really just the beginning of the fight. Let's look at the RSP party as a perfect example. They rode this huge wave of anti-establishment anger to become the fourth largest party in the country. But then reality hit. To actually be in government, they had to form a coalition with the very same old guard parties they ran against. And this is the classic trap. It forces them to compromise, and it opens the door to being co-opted by the system, which then leads to a whole new round of disillusionment among the voters who believed in them. And if you ever need a single visual to understand the core problem, this chart is it. It just lays bare the enormous gap between the youth share of the population and their actual power in parliament. Until this fundamental imbalance gets fixed, the political tension in Nepal is probably not going anywhere. So all of this leaves Nepal at a genuine crossroads. The future really isn't written yet, but based on everything we've seen, we can sketch out 3 potential paths for the nation. As we see it, there are basically 3 ways this could go. Path 1 is just more of the same, continued instability, where new parties get absorbed into the old system and the brain drain goes on. The best case scenario is genuine transformation, where these new forces actually succeed in breaking the cycle. But there's a third, darker possibility. If disillusionment becomes too widespread, it could undermine faith in democracy itself, creating fertile ground for more extreme movements. And in the end, it really all boils down to one massive question for Nepal's leaders. The energy of the nation's youth is undeniable. The question is, do you see that energy as a threat that needs to be controlled and suppressed? Or do you see it as the country's single greatest asset, something to be invested in and nurtured? The path they choose will define Nepal's future for decades to come.